Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Matrix-12-V tutorial series, where we're deconstructing Oberheim's 1985 Matrix-12 synthesizer. Today we're going to have a look at the filter section, and that's also going to involve backtracking slightly to deal with the frequency modulation section, FM, which basically ties the oscillators and kind of the filter together. Hope you enjoyed this series so far, and if you are, please check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support me. And now that we're done with the shameless plugs, let's get on with the episode. Okay, so filter first. This is a multi-point filter. We've got 15 different modes of filters to choose from, and all I did there was clicked on this where it says 4p LPF. Once I do that, we get the 15 different options. We'll have a look at those today. First thing to do is demonstrate what a filter sounds like. Here we've got our really simple sawtooth. I'm sure you're very familiar with that sound. If I pull the frequency knob down, we're going to throw away high frequencies and only be left with the low frequencies. Watch it in the spectrum analyzer. And there they are being thrown away. The angle of this slope is to do with the number of poles that are used in the filter. This is a slightly unusual terminology. In the Matrix-12, it talks about the number of poles, so this is a 4-pole low-pass filter. Ordinarily, you would see it spoken of in terms of decibels per octave. How much sound is being thrown away for every octave down the frequency range that we come. So a 4-pole LPF, or low-pass filter, is the steepest kind of slope. If I get that note going and we have a look at that slope, if I switch it to a 3-pole LPF instead, it's a more gentle slope. Less of the high frequencies are being thrown away. In other words, fewer decibels per octave are being discarded. Now I did that by accessing this knob. I just basically turned the knob and I'm cycling through the various filter modes. It's exactly the same functionality as clicking in the name itself. And you can see here are the options I just selected. Now it should be pretty obvious what the 1-pole up to 4-pole are doing, and you can see graphically it's giving you a bit of a hint as to what's going on. And similarly, a notch filter is pretty self-evident and self-explanatory. So this is a 2-pole notch filter, and in the spectrum analyzer we can see the notch, and we can change the shape of that notch using a control called resonance. So at the moment resonance is at 0. Let's see what happens when I turn that control up. You see me changing the nature of that notch. Depending on what type of filter that you've got, resonance is going to have a different effect. Let's switch back to an LPF and see what resonance looks like over here. See this spike arising, that's called a resonant peak, and the point at which the resonant peak appears is called the cutoff. Now in the Matrix-12 manual, these are described as corner points. That's unusual terminology. You normally see them called cutoff frequencies, but they use the terminology corner points in the Matrix-12 manual. It's the same thing. It's basically a mathematical point around which the filter concentrates. So this is a resonant low-pass filter. As we increase this thing more and more extremely, at the very upper end, you'll get a pretty unpleasant kind of squealing sound. I'll turn it back down again because it's really not very nice. That's a thing called self-oscillation, where the filter itself starts generating its own sine waves. Now self-oscillation sounds pretty unpleasant, generally because it's harmonically detached from the note that's been pressed. Now in this particular synthesizer, the resonance tracks with the keyboard, so each time I've turned it up to 63 to reintroduce the self-oscillation, and as I go up you can hear that sharp unpleasant sound is actually tracking with the keyboard. Very often when you get self-oscillation in synthesizers, you'll get a single static fixed tone that's constant regardless of what key you pressed. Different synths, particularly in the analog world, they all behave slightly differently, and these are the idiosyncrasies that go to make these things great. So it's just really a case of finding out how this stuff works. But if you want that really kind of violent, nasty sound, turning your resonance up to maximum is going to give it you. Let's carry on with our look at the various different modes. We've got high pass filters, high pass equals low cut. In other words, we're throwing low frequencies away and keeping the higher frequencies. And we can see that on the spectrum analyzer. All of these frequencies here should be in a straightforward linear curve, but obviously they've been attenuated. And as I increase the number of poles in the high pass filter, that attenuation gets steeper and steeper. And we've got band pass, which is the opposite of a notch. So now instead of scooping away a V shape from around a particular frequency range, we're now going to accentuate those frequencies, or more importantly, what we're really doing is attenuating or cutting away the frequencies on either side. And here we can see the inverted notch. So now we've got a little mountainous peak. The last type of filter sound that we've got is called a phase filter. So you can see 3-phase. This is also fairly commonly called an all-pass filter. Basically what happens is that like a version of the wave is imposed on itself with some of the frequencies around, once again, the corner point or the cutoff being inverted in phase. So nothing is intrinsically attenuated. Frequencies aren't actually taken away with an all-pass or phase filter. The fact that you're using phase cancellation to throw some frequencies away is the important thing. Nevertheless, we hear the same kind of manifestation. You're going to hear some of the frequencies disappear. Let's see that. And here you can see the notch around which the phase inversion is taking place. As I sweep through the frequency cutoff point or the corner point, you see a different phased notch being scooped out of the spectrum analyzer. Just as a matter of interest, phasers use this type of filtering. That's why they're called phasers. You have multi-stage phasers where different periods of frequency are basically cut out of a curve, and a phaser uses multiple different scoops, basically all kind of harmonically related but not fundamentally linked. Don't want to get into the concept of phasers today, but that's what's going on. And then obviously right up at the top we've got combinations of the two. So this is phase filtering plus low pass filtering, and you're going to get two different effects. Ooh, there's self-oscillation. Okay then, I'm going to get us back to a fairly simple low pass filter, and I'll dial some fairly sensible settings into it in order to demonstrate frequency modulation. This is down here, and the reason why I've talked about the filter before going on to talk about FM is because frequency modulation actually ties into the filter. As you can see, voltage controlled filter, this little section down here. We're going to need to understand what the filter does in order to be able to understand what the FM is doing. Now, FM is an enormous subject, and there are entire synthesizers based on this method of sound generation. The Yamaha DX7 is probably the most famous example of an FM synthesizer, released in, I think, 1983. And since then, FM synthesis has become an enormous subject in its own right. But here inside an analog synthesizer, we've got it basically being used as a modulation circuit. So you're going to hear an unusual effect, but it can't really be identified in an oscilloscope or a spectrum analyzer exactly what's going on. I'll try to explain it as well as I can. So we're going to have VCO2 disabled, so that's completely out of the picture. And we've got a really simple sawtooth going through this nice straightforward filter. And here you can see our filter cut off. Other than that, a pretty straightforward wave. Now I'm going to enable FM by increasing the amplitude or amount of frequency modulation. Let's turn it all the way up and hear what we get. See that very, very fast oscillation. Something is affecting oscillator 1 hundreds of times a second. It's actually VCO2 that's doing the job. Here's VCO2, and ordinarily we've got a path coming out of the volume component, going into the filter section. It passes through the filter section, goes through both amplifiers and off to the outside world. That's the standard route through which VCO2 gets to the outside world. But there's a second blue line, this one coming out of the waveform box. It goes down and around and into the FM module. Only when we turn the amplifier up past 0 does the signal get to go any further, and now it travels into the FM destination. It goes through this VCO1 gate, follow the line, keep going, and finally gets to modulate the frequency of VCO1. So this blue line basically kind of intercepting, coming into the frequency knob. This is a modulator. So VCO2 is acting as a modulator to VCO1's pitch. In this particular case, the terminology we use is that VCO1 has become a carrier. It's going to carry the primary signal, and VCO2 is going to modulate that signal. The way by which it's going to modulate it is using its own frequency. Now VCO2 is cycling very quickly. We can see it in the tuner. If we quickly flip the two waves, so now we're going to hear VCO2 all on its own. Its wave is cycling at 257 times a second. That's really fast. You see the fine tunes come back off this in its setting. I'll just leave it, we don't care. So 257 times a second, VCO2 is modulating the pitch of VCO1, and that's what you're hearing with the FM effect. Let's turn that back off and turn VCO1 back on. As I turn the amplitude down of the modulation, you can hear the effect basically tail away, kind of dies, because basically less modulation is being applied. Now this isn't actually mentioned anywhere on the interface, you won't see this, but in the manual it explains that VCO2 uses its triangle wave. So it doesn't matter what settings VCO2 has as far as which oscillators you have selected. It's the triangle wave of VCO2 that's hardwired into the FM module. Now let's flick this little gate. Just click that little blue light where it says VCF, or voltage controlled filter. Now we're sending the frequency modulation into the filter unit. So we're no longer modulating VCO1. Again, trace that little blue line. It's broken now. There's no link up into the modulation section of the VCO. What we've got instead is this blue line coming out here, and now we're modulating the filter cutoff. Let's have a listen to that. Not particularly dramatic, is it? It's much more difficult to identify changes in timbre, in other words, the tonal quality of the sound, than it is frequency. Kind of sounds like nothing's really going on. But watch what happens when I change the frequency level of VCO2. I'm going to slow it down as much as I possibly can. Okay, now let's play a lower note. And again. And the further down through the frequency range I go, in other words, the slower I make this oscillation, the more it starts to become almost possible to hear the oscillations. We still can't. VCO2 is still oscillating much faster than we can actually identify, but it's becoming kind of more distinct. Here's kind of bubbling rasp. And as I mess around with the various frequency options, don't forget it's the filter frequency that's being modulated here. And with a little bit of tweaking, you can get to a stage where you're generating a very lovely sound. And a lot of that timbral interest is coming from the frequency modulation. Let's turn it off and hear the difference. There's the plain tone all on its own. You can see the oscilloscope has settled down. And then we begin modulating it. You can see the wave dancing backwards and forwards. And that's with full modulation applied. So FM is a fabulous and really fascinating component of synthesizers generally. In this particular case, it's being used primarily as a modulator. It's something doing interesting things to the sound, as opposed to FM synths, where it becomes the primary sound generation module. That's a slightly different subject. And I think that'll do us for today. Hope you've enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.